Welcome to the Western Reserve Historical Society's program, Light Years Beyond Laramie, How Ned Jordan Changed Automotive Advertising and Self-Image Forever. My name is Whitney Stoniker, and I'm the Public Programs Manager for the Cleveland History Center. I'm here today with John Lutch of the Crawford Auto Aviation Museum of the Western Reserve Historical Society. John, could you tell us a little bit more about what you do for the Crawford?
Well, I'm the program and marketing manager, and that is kind of like chief cook and bottle washer. I do everything from figure out exhibits to doing promotional things to going after sponsorship for the museum, so on and so forth. There's a lot of public outreach involved in that as well.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we're glad to have you here today.
Nice to be here.
And as the title would imply, we are going to be talking a little bit about Ned Jordan. So for those of you who are familiar a little bit more with the car world, that name might sound familiar to you, but could you tell the viewers a little bit more about who Ned Jordan was?
Yeah, sure. He was born in 1882 in Wisconsin. And so he, in his formative years, he was a 19th century person into young adulthood. And he worked his way through college doing writing for newspapers and things like that. And he eventually, after graduating from college, he got a job in Dayton, Ohio with the National Cash Register Company. And you might think, well, okay, the dots are getting kind of hard to put together here, but it all works. So he worked for National Cash Register, and there was the president of that company's name was Patterson. And I'm just going to read real quick. There was a John Patterson quote that stuck with Ned Jordan forever. And Patterson said, "The husband is only half sold until his wife is sold." Now you might think, well, what does that mean exactly? Who's getting sold to what? And it's just all about if a husband in a household likes something and wants to buy it, if he doesn't have his wife's approval, it's not going to fly. And this is a guy who realized that concept really back in about 1906. So Ned Jordan, he left National Cash Register, moved back up to Wisconsin, and started working for an automobile company called Jeffrey Motors. And he worked for them for about 9 years, and he was doing promotions, publicity, ad copy, things like that. So he really began to understand the automobile world. He had no experience with it before, but and still he had no real mechanical aptitude, but he sort of got into it from the promotion and marketing area. Then in about 1916, now keep in mind 1916, we've got a world war going on, although the United States isn't involved in it yet, but there's a lot of war industry. In 1916, Jordan decides, I think I'm going to build my own car company, which is pretty gutsy during mid-war. And when you think about building a car company, the first thing that comes to mind is where are you going to get all the money to get that together? Well, Ned Jordan, and this speaks to his intelligence and his connections at the time, when he decided that he wanted to build a car company, he was able to raise $200,000 in one day in 1916. The modern equivalent of that in dollars is $5 million. So this is a guy that raised $5 million in one day to get his car company started.
Wow.
So
that is very impressive.
Very impressive. Yeah.
So you mentioned that Ned Jordan was doing work in Wisconsin, where he was originally from. But as we know, he did come to Cleveland. What made him choose Cleveland for his manufacturing company?
That's a great question. Cleveland at the time was an automobile manufacturing center. And not only that, but it was a center for transportation. We had the Great Lakes, we had railroads, highways not so much, but the mass transportation was here. The steel industry was here. So there was raw materials, there was transportation, there was an already existing automobile manufacturing presence. And so he thought, yeah, perfect place to do it. And at that time, Detroit had not superseded Cleveland in terms of production or number of car manufacturers located there and so forth. So that's why he came to Cleveland.
Well, it was a very, very smart move on his part. So Ned Jordan is out there, raising this money and making these cars. What was so special about his cars?
Nothing.
Oh! Well, that's a surprise.
Absolutely nothing. And this is where his genius comes in. Ned Jordan didn't really build cars, he assembled them from random parts. In other words, he contracted out everything from, a lot of the big manufacturers at that time, like Cadillac and Buick and let's say like Packard and things like that. These were companies, and Ford in particular, these were companies that did all the work in-house. They had foundries where they would actually pour metal for engines, and they would stamp parts, and they would have the body shop that would assemble the bodies. Ned Jordan didn't want to bother with any of that. He said that, let somebody else do that. And what I'll do is I'll subcontract it all out and have all of these disparate parts come to Cleveland where I will assemble the cars. So, I was kind of speaking tongue-in-cheek when I said nothing special about them, because they really weren't. They were kind of just a hodgepodge of random parts that went together and a nice body design, which they slapped onto the chassis. And the only kind of unique thing and the interesting marketing thing about him and his manufacturing process was that when he got the car's bodies assembled, he would go in and sort of appoint the interiors with luxury items, like real wood, on the doors and the dash, and things that would appeal aesthetically to people. So that was his kind of hook. And the other interesting thing about that was that this hook was kind of aimed at women, at a more feminine sensibility, a more feminine sense of luxury in the car. And so that was his kind of marketing ploy at that point. That was probably around 1919, 1920, which is, I think the Jordan that we have, one of them, is a 1920. That is a Jordan Playboy. And you think, well, what? What's that all about? Well, it has nothing to do with Hugh Hefner and the magazine from the 50s. The name of the car was originally going to be the Doughboy. Not the Pillsbury Doughboy, the Doughboy, which veterans in World War I coming back from Europe were called doughboys. And he thought, well, that's an interesting name. It may have appeal to soldiers, but it's also, he didn't want to really, have any kind of conflict with that. So he said, okay, and right at the same time there was an Irish stage play that was called Playboy of the Western World. And he thought, that's got a ring to it. That kind of speaks of lighthearted, frivolous living and kind of, champagne and caviar. And he said, I'm going to call my car the Playboy. So that's what he did, and it ran throughout several years.
So I want to go back a little bit to that quote by Patterson that you mentioned earlier in the interview about a man's not really sold until his wife approves of the product. Now, certainly today, there's a lot more back and forth between a couple when they're deciding on a big purchase. But back during that time period, as we all know, women unfortunately didn't really have much of a voice, and so to think this way is kind of progressive.
It is.
Could you tell me a little bit more about why Jordan kind of took that approach?
Yeah, again, he was a brilliant marketer, and he knew that, the people, the young people in the United States that were growing up or just into young adulthood right after World War I were called the lost generation, because World War I had upset and churned society for 4 years, and you had destruction and death and upheaval and social change, and there was a lot of the whole F. Scott Fitzgerald Great Gatsby idea came out of that lost generation, trying to find some meaning in social interaction and so on and so forth. And Jordan thought that, you know, people are looking for distraction. They're looking for entertainment. They're looking for a lifestyle that has nothing to do with deprivation and hardship. So he thought that if women could embrace an automobile that spoke to freedom and adventure and just kind of an indulgent lifestyle, that would add to a woman's attractiveness, and men who were kind of in the same mindset would be more willing to embrace them and also be interested in the car and want to kind of, you know, purchase something of equal value or similar. So, you know, again, in that time period, I think that, you know, with suffrage and everything else that was going on at the time, those barriers between, you know, that prevented women from having direct access or input into decisions was starting to crumble. And so he was right on the tip of that wave as it was breaking. Again, just the right place at the right time and the right idea.
Absolutely, very much a product of the time.
Yes.
You know, you have the 1920s, and you think about the image of the flapper.
Yep.
You know, women were really eager to sort of shed the trappings of what they found to be very oppressive and old-fashioned.
Exactly.
And it sounds like he just kind of jumped right in on that. And
he was a very, very astute man and could, you know, sort of sense which way the wind was blowing. So, and that's a real gift when it comes to advertising, is having sort of a gut sense of where people's sensibilities are moving. So.
Absolutely, and that kind of brings me right into the next question. So, for those who are familiar with Ned Jordan, probably what comes to mind is the "Somewhere West of Laramie" ad. So, I would love to hear more about that. Why was it so important, and what sort of what changes did it bring about?
The "Somewhere West of Laramie" ad was probably, by all estimations, in the top 1 or 2 advertisements ever created, period. Because it was so influential, it was so groundbreaking. And, you know, in the images that we have on screen, you'll see just how radical the artwork and the design work was for this particular ad. Now, keeping in mind, in the years preceding, for print ads for cars, you would see the car depicted. You would have a list of its technical attributes, the quality of the build, you know, very often the price was included, and it was all about the car. What happened in "Somewhere West of Laramie" was that all that went away. It's advertising Jordan cars, but you can't tell that it's a Jordan car in the artwork. The car and its environment are depicted almost in an abstract fashion. And I think that even if you're an automobile expert, you could look at that artwork and you wouldn't be able to tell that it was a Jordan car. What it was a beautiful, an amalgamation of artwork and text that encapsulated what we were just talking about in terms of that alternate, exciting, carefree lifestyle. And so it was the first ad that really talked about, if you buy this product, you inherit this lifestyle. And that was the first time that it happened. It set the standard right up till today for marketing. And let me just read you, you know, the artwork is really interesting. You've got this car flying down the road with a woman driving, and her scarf is flying off in the background, and she's racing a cowboy on a horse right next to the car. His hat's flying off. And the text reads, "Somewhere West of Laramie." Now think about this prose. This had never occurred before in advertising. "Somewhere west of Laramie, there's a bronco-busting, steer-roping girl who knows what I'm talking about. She can tell what a sassy pony that's a cross between Grease Lightning and The Place Where It Hits can do with 1,100 pounds of steel and action when he's going high, wide, and handsome. The truth is, the Jordan Playboy was built for her." So, I mean, that's like, we look at it today and you think, well, that's kind of corny. And there's actually more text that follows that. But at that time, that kind of verbiage was really electrifying. And it speaks of a lifestyle that is anything but humdrum, anything but routine, and embraces this new identity, a new sense of freedom, new sense of mobility, all through buying a Jordan car. And it was brilliant.
Absolutely, and I think that it sounds like it was kind of a bold move on his part.
Yeah.
You have all of these very dry, technical sort of ads that preceded this, and something that colorful, that abstract and artistic probably did make a lot of waves, I imagine. I bet it really stood out.
It did, and it was followed in the next couple of years by other Jordan ads that really pushed the boundaries of taste and acceptability. There was one that kind of, again, hinted at an evening tryst between a man and a woman that were unmarried, and it just had like an illuminated window at night. It was fairly suggestive, and it's so suggestive that it was banned by the people in the publishing world. They thought, oh, you're pushing it too far now.
Oh my.
So yeah, it did get a little bit on the racy side. But as an immediate consequence of this particular ad, this one ad, somewhere west of Laramie, a lot of the other luxury car makers could see what was coming, and they started to mimic the whole idea. In fact, Duesenberg, which was the luxury car of the period, I mean, it was, you just don't get any more expensive or more luxurious than a Duesenberg. They ran a whole series of ads for several years that, again, had no Duesenberg cars in them. One of the memorable ones was a gentleman, this was all in black and white, like a beautiful, almost an etching, of a very wealthy man sitting in what has to be like a palatial den. It looked like a robber baron's den. And he's sitting in there, and he's kind of small in the image, and you see this great big architecture around him. And all the ad says is he drives a Duesenberg. There was another one of a woman dressed in fox hunting gear with some beagles around her feet and so forth. Very chic. She drives a Duesenberg. No car, no price, no specifications, nothing. But without Ned Jordan, who knows when that concept would have come in.
Right. It seems like he really opened the door
He did.
for all of these other manufacturers to start really making these bold changes. I'm surprised to hear that it was such a turnaround from what they had been used to.
Yes.
So would you say, I'm thinking about the way that automobiles have been advertised over time, and even on into today, what are the long-term implications of what Ned Jordan did? Do you think that we can still see that?
That was a really good question. In 2015, Cadillac launched an ad program that was called Dare Greatly. And these were ads, print ads, and some video ads, again, that did not have a Cadillac car in them. The first one that came out had architecture, just sort of soaring architecture, the Cadillac logo, and the words Dare Greatly. So again, by reference, you're saying if you purchase a Cadillac, you assume the mantle of a daring individual, when in fact all you did was write a check, But again, you asked how that 1923 landmark advertising has affected things right up until today. There you have it. It's the same idea.
Right.
Refined, changed in format, but it's still the same thing.
So it really sounds to me like Ned Jordan not only revolutionized how vehicles are advertised, but also it seems like it could be argued that he was really the start of people building their identity around their vehicles, or using their vehicles to express who they are as a person. Could you tell me a little bit more about that? I'd be very curious to hear about the post-war years and how that's sort of evolved over time.
Sure. Keep in mind that when Ned Jordan came out with, somewhere west of Laramie, most cars looked very much the same. It was very hard to tell them apart. And Jordans were no different. I mean, they looked pretty much like everything else. But one of the other things that Ned Jordan did was he named his car colors. Very interesting. Instead of saying, well, you can buy a red one or a black one, you could get, like Midnight Sonata black. And that, that carries through. If you go to a paint store today and look at paint chips, none of them say green. They'll say, Tahitian waterfall or something.
Exactly.
That's a carryover from that to kind of make it seem more exclusive and more luxurious. But image in terms of automobiles, it really started, I would say, in the mid-1930s when you had the custom coach builders building things for Duesenbergs, for Lincoln, Chrysler, Packard, when you had these great, beautiful, stylish cars. And, of course, everybody aspired to something like that. And then all of that kind of came to a crashing halt with World War II because the economy shifted completely away from personal automobile manufacturing. After the war, when the economy started to get, going again, one of the interesting things that happened was the sort of California hot rod culture. These were guys who were not particularly well off, but who were mechanically skilled, and they would take cars from the 30s and, chop down the bodies, put real high performance engines in them, and would customize them like crazy. And it became sort of an identifier with counterculture, with a rebellious, like James Dean sort of approach to life. And that all started really in Southern California and spread throughout the United States and eventually abroad. And it still continues today, although hot rods, today it's not unusual to see a $500,000 hot rod in a special show because they're all made by hand. But so that notion of identifying with a vehicle really started in probably 1949, 1950, somewhere around in there, and became super refined in the 1950s. What happened simultaneously was the emergence of the California lowrider culture, which is centered on Hispanic aesthetics. And the interesting thing about that was that in Mexico, back in the day, men and women used to congregate in courtyards of towns. And what the men would do in order to become a little more attractive to the ladies was that they would really deck out their horses with really beautiful saddles and bridles and costuming and things like that. And so the whole idea was to present yourself to the feminine set and kind of display your creativity and your, aesthetics. And the same thing happened with cars. And the lowrider culture kind of took that same aesthetic. The whole idea of lowriders was low and slow. It was not about going fast. It was not about performance. It was about, look at this car, and I'm just going to creep along the road and have the chicks check us out, And the interesting thing was that the lowriders got their names because their suspensions were altered and the cars were slammed right down to the ground. The California police found this to be almost too much to bear, and so they got a law passed where the bodywork of the car could not be below the bottom rim of the wheel. So the guys that were building lowriders thought, okay, well, we'll just put adjustable suspensions in the car. So if we get caught, we can push the car body up a couple of inches and it becomes legal. And when the cops go away, we can push another button and it slams it right back down on the ground and we can go boulevard cruising. So that's another big and long-standing identifier with culture that still exists today in a very refined form and has been accepted as a real integral part of classic car history. As far as post-war identity, you see this was kind of the emergence of suburbia and the whole idea of nice house, 2 kids, dog, and you had a station wagon, and you would use the station wagon to travel around the country. And now, because of Eisenhower and the interstates, that whole mode of transportation became open to just about everybody. So again, that feeling of freedom and taking the family and getting a little adventure was all promoted through driving station wagons. So that's, some of how it carried over into
Absolutely.
Contemporary culture.
So it would seem that really people from all walks of life could express their identity through their vehicles, provided that they were, able to afford the vehicle that they wanted to use to express their identity. It wasn't just reserved for that sort of elite, but it was, everyone down to just the all-American family. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and in fact, even today, there's a movement that, for every accepted cultural movement, there's a counterculture movement. And what we see today in a whole genre of automobiles is called rat rods. And rat rods are these cars that, we have Pebble Beach and the most extraordinarily valuable cars on the planet. And this is in direct and opposite reaction to that whole aesthetic, where you don't have to have a multi-million-dollar car to be unique. These guys take cars and they're rusted. In fact, they prefer them that way. They're assembled from car parts and trucks, and and it just looks like, whoa, what is that? And they're loud and slammed down to the ground. And again, it's a whole aesthetic and a whole identity that developed out of a reaction against an established form of judgment or identity or what have you.
That's really interesting. I actually had never heard of that before, and
Yeah.
it's interesting to hear how no matter what the culture is, there is always kind of that counter to it.
Absolutely.
So that's interesting to know that that's still going on. And I understand that there is now a movement. I mean, it's hard to believe, but vehicles from the 90s are now becoming a big thing. And I know we had a show here a couple of years ago about 90s vehicles, and I understand that people who sort of grew up in the 90s and idealizing these cars are now purchasing them, and it's kind of, again, just a way to see people expressing that identity maybe that they wanted to express when they were a kid and dreaming about owning these cars, and now as adults they can.
That's right. And also because, even for people that grew up in like the 60s and the 70s, in order to purchase a real muscle car from that period, you're talking about spending a lot of money now because they're so collectible.
I bet.
But what you were saying with the Radwood movement of more contemporary cars, you still get that sort of nostalgic feeling if you grew up in that era, but they're also much, much more affordable. So you've got an easier entry level than trying to bust into the car world at a ticket price of $70,000 or $80,000.
Right.
Yeah.
And it kind of it opens up the car collector's world.
Absolutely.
So it's kind of building off of that a little bit. We're talking a lot about using vehicles to express identity. And, in an ideal world, we would all be able to get the vehicle that was just perfect for us and we really felt was just us as a vehicle. But unfortunately, we know that's not the reality, and you touched on affordability. Are there some other ways that people can sort of express that personality or identity through their vehicles, but maybe not necessarily the vehicle itself, sort of accessorizing, things like that?
That's a great question. There's a whole sub-industry in the automobile world about accessories. If you have a truck, you can put big bumpers and mud guards and push bars and winches and roof racks and all that kind of stuff. And it goes from that to lighting underneath cars and all kinds of interior accessories. So, I think because these items are mass-produced, cars are mass-produced, there's, most people cannot afford to buy a car that's produced in an edition of 200. It's more like 200,000. And so you have something that everybody else has, and you want to make it your own. And you want it to reflect your taste and your creativity, and that's where accessories come in. It's affordable, easy to do, doesn't really change the function of the car, but it just makes it a little bit more attuned to your sensibilities.
Right, right. And so, I think we could even say that, by finding a bumper sticker that really speaks to what you believe in and putting it on your car, you're kind of calling back to that Ned Jordan, identifying yourself through your vehicle. Even if it's not necessarily the vehicle that you want to be driving, you can still find ways to express yourself. I think that's really interesting. So now, kind of looking at the other end of it, the sort of ramifications, socially, psychologically, having so much image wrapped up in an object, how does that really play out? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing?
It's kind of a double-edged sword in that, let me just kind of anecdotally illustrate that. You've got a guy who is married, has a couple of kids, house in the suburbs, dog, et cetera, and he's always considered himself to be kind of a cool guy, attractive to the ladies, and now he's settled down, he's become responsible, and he's got his suburban gig going and stuff. And one day his wife comes to him and says, honey, now that we've got a third child on the way, and I'm going to have to be taking the kids to soccer practice, and I got a lot of groceries to buy and everything, I think it's time that we bought that minivan. And you see the expression on this young man's face just fall, because all of his dreams of having a Corvette and enjoying that lifestyle and being cool and all that stuff has suddenly evaporated in the face of necessity. And I'm exaggerating, but you get what I'm saying, right? Those dreams are crushed.
Right.
And that's why a lot of guys that have Corvettes are in their 60s, because they got all the other stuff out of the way, and now they finally have some free cash and freedom, and they can get what they want. But
right.
That's one of the things about over-identifying with not only a car but any material object, is that once that object is removed, what's left? That's just sort of words to live by, and that could be a house, a boat, an airplane, world vacations, all that stuff, where you build up identity and self-image around items that you've collected, essentially. And it's, not to wax too philosophical, but ultimately that's a fairly empty endeavor. And the thing is that Madison Avenue and really intelligent advertisers have used that tactic for like a century to make you feel that if you don't have this particular item, your life or your lifestyle or your identity is somehow lessened. And that's the dark underbelly of all this kind of marketing.
I see what you mean, and as we've especially learned in this past year that's been so tough for so many, the material stuff is ultimately very fragile. And it would seem to me that you're as comfortable as you might be, you're never too far away from losing or having to cut down on those material objects. And I can definitely see a danger there when the basically all of the advertising world is built on you need to have this in order to be the best person you can be.
Yeah.
I can see that becoming a dangerous sort of psychological thing when you can't have those things anymore.
Take an iPhone 11 away from an elementary school kid. Watch what happens.
Exactly. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk. I think that it is really clear that Ned Jordan made lasting contributions, not just to the automotive world, but advertising in general. And it's really interesting to see that. Do you have any final thoughts? Anything you'd like to share?
Only that the automobile has an over 100-year history right now, and I think a lot of people don't realize just how influential the whole industry was, from opening up personal transportation to advertising to lifestyle, and how much impact it actually has in our daily lives, and we don't really think about it. You know, it's so ingrained that it's second nature now.
Right.
But it has a very long and a really interesting history.
It definitely does, and I think that you know, the Crawford is the perfect place to come and get a sample of that history.
Yeah, definitely. We've got it pretty well covered here.
We certainly do. Well, John, thank you so much.
Thank you,
I really
Whitney.
appreciate your time.
Sure.
And thank you all for joining us.